And we have about 20 minutes for questions. I'd like to use my moderator's privilege and just ask one question, and it goes back to our first speaker, Professor Moore. Question for you. I was taking copious notes in the finest tradition, I'm sure, of your students at the Naval War College, hanging on your word. You talked about Mahan and the context of the tension between great powers is often economic competition, based on economic competition. I thought, well, that certainly seems very applicable to the present day. But I wanted to go back in time because around this same time, late 19th century, the United States gets in a war, the Spanish-American War, and I don't think that had very much to do with economic competition. So I wanted to talk about that. And also, you rightly mentioned Theodore Roosevelt, how he was influenced by Mahan, but I wonder if you could tie that into Roosevelt's great desire to build the Panama Canal. And I tell you up front, Panama is my favorite foreign country, with all respect to the Consul General. Do you know why? Because as far as I know, it is the only nation state created by United States-backed covert action. Am I right? But anyway, I digress.
Yeah. Mahan was writing about the great powers and potential conflicts of the great powers. And at the time, us getting involved in the war with Spain in 1898 is an outgrowth of what was going on in Cuba at the time. And so, in one sense, it doesn't fit the big grand narrative of rise and fall of great powers. Though it is the end of the Spanish Empire, so in that sense, Spain is no longer the great imperial power that it was, and it had a big impact, of course, in Spanish history, that defeat. At the time, Britain is also going to get involved in a war in South Africa, the Boer War, and Mahan was actually saw Britain and the United States at this time. Both of these wars were justified. And Mahan, in fact, said that he openly said that he was an imperialist, that the United States had to play this larger role in world affair, and it was going to have imperial possessions to take over. So it fits in the sense that the Spanish-American War fits in the Mahan storyline, in that it shows the U.S. becoming a great imperial power along the lines of other imperial powers like Britain. And of course, this triggered a big debate in the United States, with prominent Americans being, of course, anti-imperialists like Mark Twain. With regard to Theodore Roosevelt and the Panama Canal, this is something that was long seen, that there has to be an Isthmian canal for both commercial purposes but also for strategic purposes. And Mahan argued that the fleet should be kept concentrated, as did Theodore Roosevelt. But once the canal is built, then you can relax in some way that principle of concentration. Theodore Roosevelt very much took on board the lesson of the Russo-Japanese War, and his last testament to his successor, President Taft, is this long letter. And it really is amazing, because Theodore Roosevelt, wanting to pass on to his successor what's the most important issue of the day. It's not about economics, it's not about social tensions in the U.S. It is, don't divide the battle fleet until the canal is great. In other words, the strategic question is first and foremost in Roosevelt's mind. At one point, Roosevelt in the press was attributed that he was going to divide the fleet. Mahan was so incensed by that he sent a note to President Roosevelt saying, don't divide the fleet. And Roosevelt wrote back and said, I'm not that stupid. I won't do it. He doesn't use those words, but he rebukes Mahan for preaching to him about the concentration of the fleet, because he very much believed in it as well. So the canal is important because of its ability to swing forces from Atlantic to Pacific. And in the wake of the crisis in 1906 with Japan, where Roosevelt decides to do a practice cruise of the fleet, how long would it take to go from the Atlantic around to the Pacific waters? That becomes the basis for the 18-month cruise of the Great White Fleet that circumnavigated the world. So the canal is very, very important in the strategic calculations of where do you deploy the fleet.
Thank you. So we can open it up to our audience. And Aiden, if I could ask you, there's a microphone, if you could be the mic runner. So if anybody has questions, would you just be kind enough, when you ask your question, just state your name and your affiliation, if you'd be so kind. If you just raise your hand, identify you. Here we go. You, sir.
Thank you, Fred Dickinson, University of Pennsylvania. Fascinating panel. Thanks so much. I'm a Japan guy, and I'm just a political historian, so I found this panel quite fascinating for the military sort of details that you're giving. It does strike me that, from my understanding of Japanese history, and this more from that perspective, that this is not necessarily the sort of slam dunk war that it sort of comes across when you're talking about when you start with Tsushima and you sort of focus on. I mean, I do this in class too. Like, it's Roosevelt saying, greatest naval battle since Trafalgar, of course. Of course, one could make a strong argument that the war is not won on the water; it was won on the land. And so, I guess to the extent that I have a question, it would be. But might it be most appropriate when we're thinking about the sort of military legacy of this war to ask the question not how did Japan win and how did Russia lose, but why was it such a mixed bag? And if we ask that question, we could, we don't get to the 21st century where, we as Americans are particularly enamored of naval power, and we want to know the lessons of, so how can we have our next slam dunk against the Chinese or the Russians or whoever it is? But we might get to a more sort of interesting understanding of sort of the immediate aftermath where, the continent remains very contested, and Russia is still very there in good form, and that has very serious consequences for the immediate future. Maybe not all the way into the 21st century. So again, the question being, could you talk a little bit more about the mixed character of this war in terms of military tactics?
Good. So, Professor Kozarov, do you want to take the first swing?
I would say, yeah, that's a great question. I would say that first of all, during the war, the two sides, the two parties, had their advantages and disadvantages. They had to learn on the way, and there were some debates about how much they could further they could go to actually control Manchuria. And we know the outcome of the war was that Japan got some control on the southern actually branch of the actual Manchurian Railway, so-called later was called the South Manchuria Railway, and also the half of the Sakhalin Island. So there were some many kind of gains on the Japanese side, and Russia was frustrated about this. But at the same time, I believe that probably the role of we'll talk about in the next panel, the role of the United States and Teddy Roosevelt in finding some balance. And in terms of the mixed not having a clear winner, that's a good probably assumption and a good observation that yes, the two sides got their huge losses and was very costly for both sides. And but we all appraise the organizational capabilities of the Japanese and how they planned well. And I like this idea that General Admiral Togo was not a kind of coward. He was not being too vigilant. He was very prepared and just he was choosing his moment to actually strike. And there was absolutely great in terms of the impression. So if you meant the mixed results or mixed picture, so I hope that I would reflect on this.
Did you want to? Sure.
Yeah, I think the point is well taken. I do think that, we could be just sort of naval analysts and say, well, this is, exactly, the most stunning victory, almost in all of history, in terms of being a lopsided victory, but I mean, there were many, many costs, I think, to this victory, and I would just list them quickly. I mean, and I think this is too short a list, but I mean, I think if there were any Koreans present, they were not pleased with the result, not at all. And that issue still is burning in Japan-Korea relations today. I would also just, I mean, I think I've made this point, but I'll just underline it again, is that to me, you know, one of the paradoxes is when you have this kind of stunning victory, that creates a kind of hubris, which is truly dangerous. And I think that, I don't think I need to spell that out too much, but you know, I think the Japanese came, you know, during the 20s and 30s, came to the conclusion that they could do very dramatic things, and that, you know, that persuaded them to take what were obscene risks, right? If you look at the balance, say, of U.S. and Japanese GDP, for example, that famous statement about awakening a sleeping giant. Finally, on Russia, which is the country that I focused on here, as well as China, but on Russia, I think we have to realize that this, I mean, Russia, if you look across its strategic tradition and its military history, you see that they have been faced, you know, a series of very grave situations. And, you know, as is often said, they have no natural border, but so you have a kind of tendency toward Russian strategic paranoia. This episode, let's say this historical episode, only served to feed that paranoia. And you see in Russian strategic writings often say something like, in the Far East, they need a position that is absolutely self-sustaining. And what do they mean by that? They mean they cannot expect any reinforcement from Europe, that it has to be all there today and ready to go. So if you have a military posture like that, it's very destabilizing. I mean, no wonder they look extremely threatening to the whole region, because they insist on having 10 times what they, you know, would need on that first day. So it creates all kinds of problems, and Russian strategy has been aggressive, you know, as we interpret it, you know, whether it's invading Finland or invading Korea, or sorry, helping the North Koreans invade, you know, to the same area to create this sphere of influence, or invading Ukraine. So, you know, we're stuck with this Russian, very deep sense of paranoia held by Russia, which affects us today.
Okay. May I add one more? Yeah, just may I add one thought? When I was asked, actually Grant asked me to work on this topic, and it was I knew a lot about the war, and because I grew up in the Soviet Union, so we just learned a lot on the Russian history, especially military history. But then when I started to look deeply into the material, I realized that there were lots of kind of unanswered questions. Why did Russia not do this? Why did Russia not do this? Why did they do this? So why was some of the decisions was absolutely irrational? And then I met with Lyle, who was observing the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war, and he reflected on how the U.S. military were looking at the Russian actions during this war in the beginning, especially, and there were no answers. Why did they do this? Why did they not do this? So it was like lots of questions and very kind of black, dark spots, and absolutely cannot clarify what the rationale and how they were informed by what to make those decisions or not to make certain decisions. So that is interesting kind of observation.
Okay. Any other questions that we might have?
Can I just jump in here? This war is such a close-run thing, and Japan should have lost this war. They start the war with 6 battleships, all of them built in Britain. They didn't have the ability to build their own capital ships. On one day, May 15th, 1904, 2 of those battleships were sunk by mines. 1/3 of their order of battle of capital ships is gone. Just a few days after the Treaty of Portsmouth, the Mikasa suffers an explosion that peacetime, it happens, accident, like the Maine in the Spanish-American War. They would have been down to 3, but that could have happened during the war. So the war turns on these numbers and just how close run a thing it is. You know, if Russia too had decided before the war to say, let's cut a spheres of influence deal. We talk a lot about spheres of influence today. But Japan, you have Korea to the Yalu and we have Manchuria. And in the meantime, then you build up the defenses of Port Arthur, you finish the Trans-Siberian Railroad, you throw a few more battleships out to the Far East. All of a sudden, Japan is in a position that they can't win. I think if I were sitting at the beginning of this war in February 1904 and I said, what are the odds? I would say Japan's odds of winning this war are 3 out of 10. This is a war that maybe you don't want to start. It's a high-risk venture.
The Tsar had the same thoughts.
Yeah.
And he was right. Okay, that's it. Over here, where's our mic runner?
Steve Upton. I'm involved with the New Hampshire Russia Society and the New Hampshire Japan America Society. One thing that I've heard repeatedly from Russians is that if the Russians had persisted in the war instead of settling at Portsmouth, and they built up their forces in northern Manchuria, they could have turned things around away from the Manchurian coastal areas. And another thing that I've heard is that there might not have been any appetite for that because of a revolution that was going on in Russia in 1905. I wonder what thoughts you may have about those things.
Who wants to take the first swing?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, the kind of domestic explanation, the interpretation why Russia was not ready or not prepared, and also kind of expressed its negligence in terms of how to fight and what the outcome of this war might be. Many people really believed in St. Petersburg that it was no problem. Oh, Japan, what was Japan? So with the made in Britain battleships. But there was a simultaneous process in terms of social protests and the rise of the revolutionary move, the groups, and previously the anarchists. They turned out to be more socialists. So there was a lot of political kind of disturbance in the European part of Russia. And that's why probably there was a right thought that yes, they didn't persist and they didn't move forward. But I believe that it's kind of Russian tradition that they have to prepare the horse for a long time, and then when they jump on the horse, they run fast. And the same happened to the recent events in the Ukraine war. For example, in 2003, I heard from my colleague Vasily Kashin that he saw how China were developing the drones in 2003 in one of the exhibitions in military fairs in southern China, and I asked whether the Russians were ready to develop drones. And you remember, you look at this. They just only after the war with Ukraine started, they started investing and developing drones. So which is now they are kind of full-fledged production of drones and different types of drones. So they seriously. So it took 20 years for them to realize, and they looked a lot at even North Korea had developed better drones than the Russians did. I don't know why, and nobody can explain in Russia why Russia was so slow. So I think that it's part of the Russian kind of inertia, and mostly bureaucratic inertia, and also the the clashes and the disagreement between different factions, different big generals, including in the commander and among the commanders. So that probably played the role and how decision making is being made in today's decision making is being made in the Putin in Kremlin. Is he making his decision by his own, like the Tsar, who actually appointed Rozhdestvensky who didn't want to go with the second squadron as a commander, nobody knows. Is it a Tsar decision? So that was also the kind of lack of transparency in terms of making this including human resource decisions. So that's probably one of the explanations.
Yeah, I think these are very interesting questions. I think just quickly on the question of whether they could have fought on, and yeah, I think that argument is made. I'm skeptical, partly because if you spend time out there, and I have spent time in Vladivostok, and I have spent time in Siberia, and you see even today, you know, we're 120 years since, and still it's just so, the Russian position there, you know, from any point of view, is very fragile. It's just so distant from Russia's kind of strategic core that we've talked about how they couldn't get the supplies across. And so to imagine that they could build up some kind of immense force and roll over the Japanese, I think it's just not supported by the reality of logistics. And by the way, you know, that point paints a very clear contrast with the Ukraine situation today, where this war is occurring right in Russia's strategic core, and so I don't think they, you know, are nearly in the same position. But it does point out that this fundamental challenge, as I see it, as the Russian strategic position in the Asia Pacific, has always been brittle. So I guess I disagree a little with Professor Maurer. I think the deck was stacked against Russia because of its because it's really just kind of it's so distant from Russia's strategic core as opposed to Japan's strategic core. Yeah. On the internal issue, I would just say quickly that I think you're right to point to that, and I do think that's informing. In fact, that article today, that top piece that it's kind of to translate it says the special military operation, referring to Ukraine, it says, just so that it doesn't turn out like the Russia-Japan war. And one of the arguments in that piece is that, you know, the kind of revolutionary circumstances definitely forced Russia to settle on very bad terms. And so you see that today in contemporary Russia, where Putin has the place, you know, very strictly locked down, you know, and I think they're probably using immense resources to keep Russian society, let's say, in step with the war, and that despite many Russians clearly opposing the war, absolutely, that's absolutely clear, and yet still the country appears at least to be united in its efforts, and that is a clear recognition of that lesson.
Professor Goldstein, you do get the final word. We are at time, so now it's break. I hope our panelists can remain. If you have questions, you can approach them, and then we'll reconvene at 10:45 for our next panel, which will be Hal Warza, the Treaty of Portsmouth. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.